Roll call. I have the entire council is here in its entirety. And we will move to agenda item C1 under administration. We're going to discuss the revisions to the proposed alcohol ordinance, and I'll turn it over to Mr. Barr.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Mayor. As everyone is aware, we began this process back some months ago, and we even had gotten to the second reading of the proposed revisions to our current alcohol beverage code of ordinances. At that point in time, we paused, and I think we had a very good discussion with our stakeholders. What I'd like to do right now is to briefly outline that discussion and then talk about what our process will be moving forward. And so, within the context of that discussion, there were several areas that were brought up by the stakeholders, by the restaurant owners, and let me just briefly cover those now. One was the need for a surveyor's certificate. The current proposed ordinance requires all restaurants and businesses within that category to provide a surveyor's certificate indicating their location in proximity to any locations, churches, schools that would be restricted and prohibited. It also defines and creates an opportunity for open areas and patio sales. However, it does create some criteria for that particular space of the restaurant. It emphasized our current ordinance wherein 60% of the receipts must be allocated toward food and 40% toward alcoholic beverages. There was also some discussion about the hours of operation. There was a request to push the closing times back 1 hour. There was also a lot of discussion about visibility. That's something that a lot of the restaurants sort of struggle with in terms of visibility, and so we clarified why that was important. It's currently in the ordinance, and we sort of continue to emphasize that in the revisions. So there was good back and forth regarding, from staff and the city's perspective, why that was a requirement from a public safety perspective and other reasons. And the stakeholders had an opportunity to share their concerns and explain why they had a tendency to restrict the visibility into their places of business. And so after what I thought was a very fruitful 2.5-hour discussion, all council members were there. I believe Councilwoman Leonetti could not attend due to her being out of country. But we had good attendance from the council, and staff had opportunity to present, and we also had good attendance by the business community. And so as a result of that conversation, staff went back and made some recommendations that we'd like to now propose to the council for consideration for amendment or further amendment to the ordinance. Let me just add to that, we checked with the city attorney, and even if all of the recommendations are incorporated into a revised version, it was his opinion that that did not represent a significant enough change to where we would need to go back to a first reading. However, staff is recommending that in the interest of full disclosure and transparency, that we would begin back at a first reading. And so whatever changes are sort of agreed upon tonight based on sort of a consensus, we will make those changes to the ordinance, proposed ordinance, and then we will have a first reading of that ordinance in August, and a second reading in September, and hopefully an adoption in September. We also talked a lot about our education process, wherein the city staff would attend the Clarkston Business Association meetings when asked to provide an informal Q&A regarding the provisions of this ordinance and provide instructions regarding how to comply with the provisions. We also indicated that we would hold a formal workshop in September, wherein again we would provide instructions regarding the provisions of the ordinance and also talk about how we intend to enforce or ask for compliance with the documentation that's required therein. And so we feel like it's a good, we've had a good process of dialogue and stakeholder involvement. We think that the city is doing a very good job of willingness to listen to stakeholders and to react accordingly. We feel good about the emphasis on education versus enforcement. And we feel good that the staff has recommended some reasonable changes and alterations to our current recommendations, and we'd like to go over those now. Although this will be handled in a separate agenda item, there was a proposal to increase fees, and I'll talk more about that in a moment. But within this context, there was some discussion about fees, and staff is recommending that there be a $250 across the board increase. I'll put a pin in that and we'll talk more about that at the next agenda item. Food sales. Staff has recommended that we amend the current percentage breakdown of 60-40 and adopt a 51%, 49% breakdown for alcohol sales, food sales versus alcohol sales. The surveyor certificate, staff is recommending that we exempt all existing businesses from that requirement. And so only new businesses would be required to provide a surveyor certificate. Or if a business was not in operation for greater than 6 months, then any subsequent business would lose their grandfathering and a new surveyor certificate would be required. Amusement machines, I failed to mention amusement machines. There was a lot of discussion about amusement machines, especially as it relates to convenience or package stores. There was a request to consider reducing the number but not eliminating them entirely. Staff's recommendation still is to reduce amusement machines entirely. I understand that there may be a need for some discussion on that particular item. And so with that, that's our presentation. Just to summarize again, we feel like this has been a very constructive process. I think everybody was pleased with the outcome and the results. And with that, I'll turn it over to the council for discussion.
All right, thank you, Mr. Clark. Okay, play that.
I'm looking at the food sales, and I'm not quite convinced that it should be lowered. I was just thinking, basically they have to serve 2 meals a day. So if you're serving lunch, you're not going to get a huge percentage of alcohol sold with lunch, basically. So if the sales at lunchtime would augment what they would consider they needed for the dinner crowd, would you then end up with a bar-type atmosphere at night because they don't have to sell so much food if they've already met their criteria at lunchtime? And so you'd have to really convince me to change that to 51%. I'm thinking it's not going to work like we think it is.
Anybody else on council?
That's just an observation. I'm just thinking it through here.
Yeah, I have to say I'm the one who proposed 51%. I think that the spirit of that suggests that a restaurant's primary source of revenue is from food. And I think we heard some informal suggestions from stakeholders at our recent meeting to, in fact, flip it completely, to do a 40-60 split. And I was of the opinion that it was a good compromise, but to keep the spirit of in fact, the greater, that what defines a restaurant is that the greater total of their sales is from food. And the 51%, albeit a nominal difference between 50-50, still meets the intent.
I wanted to add that just use this kind of reasoning here for a minute. If if all restaurants are going to have a food menu, and they have those foodstuffs in their kitchen and the coolers and the walk-ins, they're not going to want to let it sit around and rot. They're going to do all they can to sell food, whether it's lunchtime or dinner time. So I think what we're trying to address is the difficulty that they have. That we essentially felt some sympathy for them, that they felt like they were under undue hardship to try to meet that kind of an extreme percentage. So I think just taking it from the point of view that, if you've got food that you paid for in your cooler, you need to use it, you need to sell it before it spoils. They're going to make a good faith effort to sell 60%, 70%, what they're going to make, they want to sell everything they can. Anyhow.
Okay, thank you.
That's it.
Well, there was some mention at our meeting that some of these stakeholders actually have people use the restaurant for different events and occasions, and they bring their own food there. They still have to buy their alcohol. They're not allowed to bring alcohol with them. So this was a reduction of their requirement on this, was to help them keep that same clientele, excuse me, in the same, be able to keep their alcohol sales up as well.
But did we decide that that would be a special, something different than just your ordinary restaurant running during the day? If they have an event where they're actually allowing people to bring food in, that have to have some kind of a different permit or something for that particular evening?
Yeah, I think the issue is we'll need to check to see if that is an allowable activity and use for that zoning and for that licensure in which they work. And so that may be a contributing factor to their ability to make the percentage food sales, but it's not pertinent to this particular discussion.
Yeah, I think when we were talking, I think I mentioned that falls under the category of catering when you go into that category. But,
So they would still be required to make this 51-49% regardless of how many private parties they had or anything else. So
That is correct.
Also, I want to mention, or I asked the city manager, did y'all have any consideration on the hours of operation? I know we discussed it.
The recommendation was not to change the hours.
That's what I need to do. Okay, thank you.
On the retail package sale of alcoholic beverages at the Citgo, I think it was, they requested to extend their sales on Sunday evening from 11:30 to 12 midnight because of some difficulties they had with some of the people coming in there and couldn't understand why 11:30 was the cutoff and not 12 midnight. Can we extend that to midnight for them?
You can choose to do that. Your ordinance is. The earlier question was,
about that.
was that staff's recommendation? The answer to that is no, staff is not recommending
that at the work session.
that you change those hours.
The meeting.
But you certainly can, but that's not a recommendation from staff.
I think the intent was to try to make sure that because Sunday was, had its own specific set of hours designated, the intention was to exclusively keep the range of hours for sales on Sunday within Sunday itself and not bleed over to the next day.
Next Monday, yeah. All right, I basically wanted to let you guys know, since we got so many items on our agenda, I'd like to basically cut our discussion time maybe down to 5 or 10 minutes per item. I'd appreciate your cooperation on that so we can get through this.
Make any comments in there on any of the other provisions?
Yeah, sure.
As others on council are aware, I forwarded one of the messages I received from one of the stakeholders that represents a convenience store that does beer and malt beverage sales